After my wife's affair with my boss, I lost my job, my home, my kids. You'll die broke and lonely, she texted. Moving into an old storage unit, I found a locked briefcase with my name on it. Inside was $60,000 cash, a flight ticket, and a note. This is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. When I arrived, what I saw made me understand everything. My name is Marcus Hale, and 6 months ago I had a life that looked pretty decent from the outside if you squinted hard enough and ignored the cracks in the foundation. I had a 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood where people still waved at each other from their driveways, a mortgage that made me wake up in cold sweats twice a month, and a Ford F-150 that coughed like a chain smoker every time I turned the ignition, but still managed to get me to work and back without dying on the highway. The house smelled perpetually like my wife Claire's cinnamon candles, which she bought in bulk from some multi-level marketing scheme that promised financial freedom and delivered nothing but waxy regret. I had 2 kids who thought I could fix literally anything as long as I had access to YouTube tutorials and a decent internet connection. Ben, my 14-year-old son, was built like a linebacker and had the emotional range of a brick wall, and Sophie, 11 going on 35, spent her weekends building model rockets in the garage and telling me I was being too dramatic whenever I suggested we actually talk about our feelings like a normal family. Now I live in a 5x10 storage unit at SecureLock Storage off Route 9, which is essentially a prison cell with better shelving options and significantly worse plumbing, by which I mean no plumbing whatsoever. The cot I sleep on squeaks like it has strong opinions about my life choices every time I shift my weight, which is often because sleeping on a cot designed for a Boy Scout camping trip when you're a 42-year-old man with back problems is about as comfortable as sleeping on a bag of rocks. The only light I've got is a battery-powered camping lantern that flashes low battery at me every 30 seconds like some judgmental robot reminding me that I can't even afford AA batteries in bulk anymore. The walls are corrugated metal that sweat in the summer and freeze in the winter, and my neighbors are boxes of old tax returns, a broken leaf blower I keep telling myself I'll fix, and the crushing weight of my own poor decisions. Tonight's dinner was a dented can of beans I'd been staring at for 3 days, trying to work up the enthusiasm to actually eat something that looked like it had survived a minor apocalypse. I was opening it with a spoon because I'd lost my can opener somewhere between the storage unit and rock bottom, which is harder than it sounds and requires the kind of determination usually reserved for people trying to open child-proof medicine bottles at 3 in the morning. As I jabbed at the can with increasingly violent frustration, I thought about how absolutely romantic my life had become. Cold food, colder nights, and the persistent smell of industrial cleaning products mixed with despair. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be living like a homeless Ron Swanson without any of the dignity or breakfast meat, I would have laughed them out of the room. That's when I found the briefcase. It was shoved in the back corner of the unit behind a stack of boxes labeled kitchen stuff in Claire's annoyingly perfect handwriting, the kind of handwriting that looks like it belongs in a greeting card commercial. Brown leather, scratched to hell, with brass latches that had gone green with age and a smell that reminded me of old libraries and secrets. There was a luggage tag attached to the handle with string, and written on it in handwriting I recognized immediately was my full name, Marcus Daniel Hale. The handwriting belonged to Earl Finch, my uncle on my mother's side, the same eccentric man who used to show up to Thanksgiving dinner with 1 too many homemade fruitcakes that tasted like despair and dried fruit, who called the mayor a sugar-tongued weasel at the 4th of July parade in 2019, and who died 8 months ago alone in his house surrounded by newspapers and conspiracy theories. The briefcase was locked, but the key was taped to the bottom because Earl was paranoid but also practical in the weirdest ways possible. Inside was $60,000 in cash, mostly hundreds and fifties, bundled with rubber bands and smelling faintly of pipe tobacco. There was also a plane ticket with an airline stamp and a destination I never would have expected in a million years, and a handwritten note on yellow legal paper that said, "Marcus, this is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. Don't trust anyone from Langdon's Circle. Finish what your father started. Uncle Earl." The note smelled like Earl's cherry pipe tobacco and a lifetime of keeping secrets that probably should have been shared over beers instead of being locked in a briefcase and hidden in a storage unit. I sat there on my squeaky cot, holding $60,000 in cash like it was a live grenade, staring at the money like it was some kind of magic trick performed by a dead man with a twisted sense of humor. It didn't solve everything, not even close, but it solved an awful lot of immediate problems, like whether I'd have to start selling plasma or my kidney or maybe my nostril hair to science just to make rent on a storage unit that didn't even have a bathroom. The funny thing about hitting rock bottom is that you get this sudden, horrible clarity about your life mixed with the kind of terrible jokes that would make a stand-up comedian walk off stage in shame. I told myself, great, just absolutely fantastic. I lose my house, my job, my kids, my dignity, and my ability to sleep on an actual mattress, and now a dead man who collected conspiracy theories like baseball cards leaves me cash and an invitation to go on what is guaranteed to be the absolute worst treasure hunt of my entire life. I laughed, which turned into crying, which turned back into laughing because at a certain point your emotional range just gives up and lets you do whatever. Then I packed my duffel bag with the 3 shirts I owned, the jeans that still fit, the cash, the ticket, and what was left of my pride, which could fit in a sandwich bag. Carl, the night security guard who pretended not to see me living here in exchange for me pretending not to see him watching Netflix on his phone during his entire shift, knocked on the metal door and asked if I was okay. I told him I was great, just absolutely living the dream, and he laughed that dead-inside laugh that people who work overnight shifts have perfected. I told him I'd be gone for a while, maybe forever, and he said, "Good luck, man, and hey, if you find any treasure, remember who let you shower in the employee bathroom." I promised I would. Before I became the guy living in a storage unit eating beans with a spoon and contemplating whether rock bottom has a basement, I was actually somebody. Not somebody important like a senator or a guy who gets recognized at Costco, but somebody with a job title, a direct deposit, and the kind of routine that makes you feel like you've got your life together even when you absolutely don't. I was a supervisor at Langdon Mill, which sounds fancier than it actually was because supervisor just meant I got to wear a slightly cleaner shirt than everyone else and pretend I knew what I was doing when the machinery broke down. I'd been there 18 years, which is long enough to have a permanent sawdust tan, the kind where you look vaguely orange in certain lighting and people assume you either work with wood or have made some seriously questionable decisions at a tanning salon. I actually liked the smell of lumber at sunrise, which I realize makes me sound like the kind of person who writes poetry about Home Depot. But there's something honest about fresh-cut pine when the morning air is still cold and the coffee is still hot. Other people wear cologne that costs more than my car payment. I wore cedar and oak and whatever the hell kind of wood we were processing that week. My wife Claire used to say I smelled like work, and in the early days of our marriage, she'd actually shove her nose into my shirt when I got home like it was some kind of medicine she needed to survive the day. She'd breathe in deep and say, "That's my Marcus," smelling like he actually accomplished something. And I'd feel like maybe I was doing okay at this whole adult thing. The mill itself was this massive operation on the edge of town, the kind of place that employed half the county and made the other half nervous about property values. We processed timber from 3 states, turned trees into boards, boards into money, and money into paychecks that kept the local economy from completely collapsing every time the national news talked about recessions. My boss, Graham Lockwood, ran the place like he was the king of a very small, very woody kingdom. He had the kind of charm that seemed expensive, like he'd bought it in bulk from some catalog that only rich people have access to, and he paid for every ounce of that charm with other people's trouble. Graham was the type of guy who smiled at you while signing your pink slip, who remembered your kid's name, but not your anniversary, who made you feel important right up until the moment you realized you were completely expendable. I should have seen the red flags, but hindsight is a liar who waits until you're completely screwed before showing up to tell you in the loudest possible voice how stupid you were. Graham was always too friendly with Claire at company barbecues, always too interested in how she was doing, always too quick with compliments about her hair or her dress or whatever the hell she was wearing that day. I chalked it up to him being a friendly boss, which is like chalking up a shark circling your boat to it being a friendly fish that just wants to say hello. Back then, my life had a rhythm that felt comfortable, even if it was slowly killing me with monotony. I'd wake up at 5:30, kiss Claire on the forehead while she pretended to still be asleep, make coffee that could strip paint, and drive to the mill while listening to talk radio hosts argue about things that didn't matter. I'd spend 8 to 10 hours making sure nobody lost a finger to the machinery, filling out paperwork that felt important but probably ended up in a file cabinet nobody ever opened, and managing a crew of guys who ranged from dedicated professionals to people who were one minor inconvenience away from quitting and becoming full-time fishermen. My son Ben was 14 and built like he'd been assembled from spare linebacker parts. The kid was stubborn as a mule with a philosophy degree, and he had this way of looking at me like he was constantly disappointed but couldn't quite articulate why. We'd try to have father-son talks that always ended with him grunting responses that could mean anything from, "I love you, Dad," to, "I'm considering running away to join the circus." I taught him how to change oil, how to throw a spiral, how to patch drywall after you punch it in a moment of frustration, which is a skill every man eventually needs. He tolerated my advice the way teenagers tolerate vegetables, with visible suffering and the promise that someday this would all be over. Sophie, my 11-year-old daughter, was a completely different creature. She built model rockets in the garage using kits she bought with her allowance, watched YouTube videos about aerodynamics, and told me I was too dramatic whenever I suggested we have conversations about feelings or emotions or any of that stuff that parents are supposed to talk about with their kids. She had Claire's sharp intelligence and my ability to completely miss social cues, which was either going to make her a brilliant engineer or a deeply awkward adult, possibly both. She called me Dad Marcus when she was annoyed with me, which was often, and she had this habit of explaining things to me like I was a child who'd just discovered fire. "Dad Marcus, you can't fix the dishwasher with duct tape. That's not how appliances work. That's not how any of this works." Those were the days we ate cereal from mugs because all the bowls were dirty and nobody felt like doing dishes. The days we thought bills were temporary illusions that would somehow resolve themselves if we ignored them long enough. The days we were a family in the messy, imperfect way that actual families are messy and imperfect. I'd come home smelling like sawdust. Claire would have dinner going or not going, depending on how her day went, and we'd sit around the table making small talk about homework and mill gossip and whether we could afford to fix the air conditioning before summer hit, like a hammer made of humidity. I joke about power tools now, mostly because it's easier than facing the actual truth. If marriage is a toolbox, mine had been missing a few critical pieces for longer than I wanted to admit. Claire had been distant for months, maybe longer, but I'd blamed it on my long shifts at the mill, on the stress of raising 2 kids in a house that was too small in a town that was too familiar. She blamed the house, the money, the fact that I worked too much and dreamed too little. We'd have these circular arguments that went nowhere, like 2 people trying to build furniture with instructions written in different languages. I'd say I was working for us, for the family, for the future. She'd say the future didn't matter if we weren't happy in the present. We were both right, and both wrong, and both too stubborn to admit it. Looking back now with the bitter clarity that comes from having your entire life dismantled like cheap IKEA furniture, I can see that Claire wasn't just distant. She was rehearsing for a different life with a different leading man, practicing her lines for the moment she'd walk off stage and leave me holding the props. But back then, I thought we were just going through a rough patch, the kind of thing every marriage goes through. I thought if I worked harder, made more money, fixed more things around the house, eventually we'd get back to the place where she smelled my shirt and smiled. I was an idiot with good intentions and a toolbox missing all the important pieces. It was a slow Thursday in late April, the kind of day where time moves like cold honey and every minute feels like it's personally offended you. My stomach had been doing this thing all morning where it felt like I'd been chewing tin foil mixed with anxiety and bad gas station coffee, which is a specific kind of nausea that hits you when your subconscious knows something your conscious brain refuses to acknowledge. I kept telling myself it was probably the breakfast burrito I'd grabbed from the Quick Stop, the one that cost $1.50 and tasted like regret wrapped in a tortilla, but deep down in that place where men store all the feelings they don't want to deal with, I knew it was something worse. Around 2 in the afternoon, I told Danny Reeves, one of the shift leads who'd been at the mill almost as long as me, that I was cutting out early. Danny was the kind of guy who never asked questions he didn't want answers to, which made him either a really good friend or someone who'd perfected the art of minding his own business. He just nodded, spit his tobacco into a Gatorade bottle that was doing double duty as a spittoon, and said, "You look like hell, Hale. Go home and sleep it off." I appreciated that he didn't pry, didn't ask if everything was okay with Claire or the kids or my life in general. He just let me go like a man releasing a fish that's too small to keep. The drive home took 17 minutes, which I know because I counted every single one of them like a prisoner counting days until parole. I drove past the Dairy Queen where Claire and I had our first date 17 years ago, past the elementary school where both kids had learned to read and throw dodgeballs at each other's faces, past the church where we'd gotten married in front of 87 people who promised to love and support us through thick and thin, and then mostly disappeared when things got actually thin. Every familiar landmark felt like it was mocking me, like the entire town was in on some joke I hadn't been told yet. I pulled into my driveway and saw Graham's black Cadillac sedan parked where my truck usually sat, big and expensive and completely out of place in a neighborhood where most people drove practical vehicles that got decent gas mileage and didn't scream, "I make more money than everyone on this block combined." My brain did this thing where it immediately started making worst-case scenario headlines in 5 seconds flat. Local supervisor returns home early, finds boss's car in driveway. Everything is definitely fine and not at all what it looks like. I sat there in my truck with the engine running, gripping the steering wheel hard enough to leave imprints, trying to come up with any innocent explanation for why Graham Lockwood would be at my house in the middle of a Thursday afternoon when he should have been at the mill pretending to work. Maybe he was dropping off paperwork. Maybe Claire had called him about a problem with my benefits package. Maybe he'd stopped by to discuss a company barbecue or a safety training seminar, or literally anything that wasn't what I knew in my gut it actually was. I cycled through about 15 different scenarios, each one more desperate and pathetic than the last, before finally turning off the engine and getting out of the truck like a man walking to his own execution. The front door was unlocked, which was the first bad sign because Claire was paranoid about home security ever since she'd watched a true crime documentary about break-ins and spent 2 weeks checking all the locks 3 times before bed. I walked through the living room where Sophie's model rocket sat half-finished on the coffee table, past the kitchen where dishes from breakfast were still in the sink, up the stairs that creaked in all the same places they'd been creaking for the past 9 years. I climbed those stairs like a man practicing a speech he didn't want to make, running through opening lines in my head that ranged from reasonable to homicidal. At the bedroom door, I heard Claire's laugh, and that's what broke something fundamental inside my chest. It wasn't the soft, private laugh she used to give me when I burned pancakes on Sunday mornings or when I'd tell terrible dad jokes that only I found funny. This was a public laugh, the kind of laugh people use at cocktail parties when they're trying to impress someone, the kind of laugh that's been practiced in front of mirrors and perfected through repetition. It was the sound of someone buying a brighter future with someone else's credit card, and it cut through me like a table saw through cheap pine. I opened the door without knocking because this was my house, my bedroom, my marriage, and I'd be damned if I was going to politely announce myself before catching my wife in bed with my boss. Graham was there, in my home, on my bed, on sheets I'd helped pick out at Target. Acting like the whole place was a rental property, he was test driving before signing a lease. He was still mostly dressed, which was somehow worse than if he'd been completely naked, like he couldn't even be bothered to fully commit to the betrayal. When he saw me standing in the doorway, he had the audacity to look annoyed rather than ashamed, like I was the one interrupting something important rather than him actively destroying my entire life. He stood up, smoothed his shirt like he was about to give a presentation to the board of directors, and said in that same calm voice he used when discussing quarterly earnings, "Marcus, we can discuss this at the office on Monday." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "This isn't what it looks like." Not even a basic acknowledgement that he was screwing his supervisor's wife in said supervisor's house. Just a polite suggestion that we handle this professionally, because I guess adultery is more efficient when you're wearing a tailored suit and have a good HR department to back you up. Claire sat up in bed, pulling the comforter around herself like modesty mattered at this point, and she had this look on her face that I'd never seen before. It wasn't guilt or shame or even embarrassment. It was relief, like she'd been waiting for this moment and was glad it was finally here. I asked the stupidest question in the history of stupid questions. How long? Like the duration somehow mattered, like there was an acceptable timeline for betrayal that would make this hurt less. She answered like she was checking the weather forecast or deciding what to make for dinner, completely casual and matter of fact. "Long enough, Marcus." long enough that it doesn't matter anymore. Then she said, with the kind of brutal clarity that only people who've been rehearsing their breakup speech can deliver, that I had never been enough. Not enough money, not enough ambition, not enough excitement, just not enough of whatever she decided she needed. She told me she'd been pretending for years, playing the role of happy wife and devoted mother while internally auditioning for a better production with a bigger budget and a more impressive leading man. I stood there in the doorway of my own bedroom, watching the marriage I thought I knew melt into a bad soap opera, complete with dramatic revelations and a villain who wore expensive cologne. Part of me wanted to crack a joke, to tell them I'd just been rehearsing for a surprise party and they'd both passed the test with flying colors. Part of me wanted to flip the bed over like an angry Jesus in the temple. But mostly I just wanted to leave before I became the punchline to a joke I didn't find funny. So I walked out, because dignity sometimes involves knowing when to exit stage left before the audience starts throwing tomatoes. Within a week of catching my wife in bed with my boss, Graham Lockwood did what people with money and power and a complete lack of conscience do really well. He made things happen with the efficiency of a machine designed specifically to ruin lives. I woke up one Monday morning in the guest bedroom of my buddy Rick's house, where I'd been sleeping on a futon that smelled like his golden retriever and broken dreams, to a phone call from Danny Reeves telling me not to bother coming into work. When I asked why, thinking maybe there'd been some kind of accident or shutdown, he got real quiet in that way people get when they're about to deliver news that's going to hit you like a sledgehammer to the kidneys. He said security had been briefed to escort me off the property if I showed up, and that according to the official company memo sent out at 6 in the morning, budget cuts meant my position had been eliminated effective immediately. Budget cuts. That's what they called it when a man who'd given 18 years of his life to a company suddenly became expendable because he'd walked in on the boss playing house with his wife. I'd seen the quarterly reports. Langdon Mill wasn't hurting for money. We'd just landed 3 new contracts with developers in Idaho and Montana, and Graham had spent the previous month bragging about profit margins at the weekly management meetings. But apparently my salary, my benefits, my entire professional existence had become a line item that needed cutting, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it, because Graham had lawyers who specialized in making illegal things look perfectly legal. I drove to the mill anyway, because I'm stubborn and stupid in equal measure, and I wanted to look Graham in the eye and at least make him acknowledge what he'd done. The security guard at the gate was Tommy Briggs, a kid I'd helped get hired 2 years ago when his mom came to me desperate because Tommy had a record for petty theft and nobody would give him a chance. Tommy looked absolutely miserable as he stepped out of the guard shack and told me he couldn't let me through. He apologized about 6 times in 30 seconds, said he had a new baby at home and couldn't afford to lose this job, and I told him I understood because I did. Tommy was just another working guy trying to survive, and Graham knew exactly which people to squeeze to make sure everyone stayed in line. The legal destruction came next, swift and surgical like a shark attack choreographed by someone who'd studied every episode of Law and Order. Claire had hired Sharon Meeks, a divorce attorney who had a reputation for turning parking tickets into federal cases and who charged $500 an hour to make men like me disappear from their own lives. Judge Patricia Rourke, who smiled too much at charity galas and had a vacation home that nobody could quite figure out how she'd afforded on a county judge's salary, signed every piece of paper Sharon Meeks put in front of her like she was autographing books for fans. The custody hearing was a masterclass in character assassination. Sharon painted me as unstable, volatile, a man on the edge of violence who couldn't be trusted around his own children. Her evidence? That one angry moment 3 weeks after I'd caught Claire cheating, when I'd punched the garage door and left a handprint dent in the metal because I'd been on the phone with the bank trying to explain why I couldn't make the mortgage payment and my entire life felt like it was collapsing into a sinkhole. One punch, thrown at an inanimate object in my own garage, became proof that I was dangerous. Never mind that I'd never raised a hand to Claire or the kids. Never mind that I'd spent 14 years coaching Ben's Little League teams and building Sophie's rocket kits at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep. None of that mattered because Sharon Meeks had turned my worst moment into my defining characteristic, and Judge Rourke had nodded along like it all made perfect sense. Claire testified that she was afraid of me, which was such a blatant lie that I actually laughed out loud in the courtroom, which did not help my case. My lawyer, A public defender named Gerald Stokes, who looked like he'd given up on life sometime during the Clinton administration, told me to keep my mouth shut and let him handle it. Gerald handled it by basically agreeing with everything Sharon said and pleading for supervised visitation, which the judge granted with the kind of magnanimous smile people use when they're pretending to be fair while actively screwing you over. I got to see my kids twice a month, supervised by a social worker named Linda Peterman, who took notes on every interaction like she was documenting evidence for a criminal trial. Ben wouldn't talk to me during those visits, just sat there with his arms crossed looking at his phone while I tried to make conversation about school and football and anything that might get him to acknowledge I still existed. Sophie asked technical questions about why the legal system was allowed to separate families based on unproven allegations of instability, which was her way of telling me she thought the whole thing was garbage without actually saying it. Those 2 hours every other Saturday became the highlight and the absolute worst part of my month, seeing my kids but not really having them, being their father in name only while supervised by a woman who wrote down every time I said something that could be interpreted as inappropriate. I slept in my truck at first, parked behind the Walmart where security didn't hassle you as long as you moved by 7 in the morning when the early shift started arriving. I learned which fast food places had bathrooms that didn't require purchase codes, which gas stations let you wash up in the sink if you were quick about it, which parts of town had the best overnight parking that wouldn't get you a ticket or a knock on the window from cops who were either sympathetic or sadistic depending on their mood. It's amazing how quickly you can go from middle-class respectability to homeless adjacent when the systems designed to protect you decide you're expendable. Then I did the rounds of friends' couches, each one with a specific expiration date determined by how much their wives or girlfriends were willing to tolerate a depressed, divorced guy sleeping on their furniture. Rick gave me 2 weeks before his wife Jennifer started making pointed comments about how I needed to get my life together. My cousin Travis let me stay in his basement for a month before his new girlfriend said I was making her uncomfortable, which I understood because I'd stopped showering regularly and probably smelled like a gym bag full of sadness. Everyone was sympathetic right up until sympathy became inconvenient, and then suddenly they remembered they had house projects or family visiting or any excuse that meant I needed to find somewhere else to be. Finally, I scraped together $89 from doing odd jobs and day labor, and I rented storage unit 247 at Secure Lock Storage. The woman at the desk, whose name tag said Brenda and whose expression said she'd seen this exact situation about 1,000 times, asked if I needed climate control. I said yes because I was planning on living in it, and she pretended not to hear that part. I set up a camping cot by the ventilation slats, arranged my boxes of belongings into something resembling furniture, and learned to cook ramen on a camping stove without setting off the fire alarms. Carl, the night security guard, became my only real neighbor. He was about 60, had a deadpan sense of humor that would make Stephen Wright jealous, and pretended not to notice that I was clearly living in violation of about 16 different storage facility regulations. One night he knocked on my unit and handed me a sandwich from the vending machine. "At least you got climate control," he said, which I thought was a joke until I realized he was completely serious and actually thought I'd made a practical decision. We became friends in that way men become friends when they're both operating on the margins of normal society. Minimal conversation, maximum understanding, and an unspoken agreement not to ask too many questions about each other's lives. The text from Claire arrived on a Tuesday at 11 at night, right when I was trying to fall asleep on my squeaky cot, while listening to someone in Unit 248 apparently reorganizing their entire life at maximum volume. The message said, "You'll die broke and lonely." All caps, like she was screaming it through the phone. I typed back something witty about how at least I'd die with my dignity intact, then deleted it because engaging with Claire at this point was like arguing with a tornado, pointless and likely to make everything worse. I was broke, absolutely, no argument there. Lonely? That remained to be seen, because in my experience, life has a habit of throwing curveballs right when you think you've figured out the pattern. Earl Finch, my uncle on my mother's side, had been what polite people call eccentric and what honest people call absolutely batshit crazy in the most harmless way possible. He'd spent the last 30 years of his life living alone in a house that looked like a library had a baby with a hardware store, surrounded by newspapers stacked in chronological order, Books about government conspiracies that range from plausible to completely insane, and enough canned goods to survive multiple apocalypses with different themes. My mom used to say Earl had a brilliant mind that went sideways, which was her gentle way of explaining why her brother showed up to family gatherings wearing a cardigan covered in cat hair despite not owning a cat, and why he'd corner you at Thanksgiving to explain how the fluoride in tap water was connected to declining test scores and the suspicious abundance of left-handed politicians. Earl died 8 months ago, alone in his house, and nobody found him for 3 days because he'd alienated most of his neighbors with pamphlets about chemtrails and lectures about property rights. The funeral was small, attended by me, my mom, a handful of people from his church who felt obligated to show up, and a mailman named Dennis who said Earl had been the only person on his route who actually read the mail instead of throwing it away. The pastor gave a generic eulogy about Earl being unique and passionate about his beliefs, which is what you say when you can't think of anything genuinely nice, but also don't want to speak ill of the dead. I remember standing at the graveside thinking that Earl had wasted his life chasing shadows and suspecting everyone of crimes they'd never committed, and I felt sad in that distant way you feel sad about people you loved but never really understood. At Thanksgiving, back when things were still normal and I had a house and a family and hadn't yet discovered that my entire life was a carefully constructed lie, Earl used to hand out pamphlets he'd printed at Kinko's on the cheapest paper possible. The pamphlets had titles like People Who Steal Smiles, A Citizen's Guide to Corporate Manipulation, and The 7 Warning Signs Your Mayor is Compromised, and they were filled with dense paragraphs of text that connected dots nobody else could see. I used to laugh at them, throw them away in the car before Claire could see them, and make comments about how my family was full of characters. I thought Earl was harmless, a lonely old man who'd watched too many documentaries and had too much time to think. I never imagined that maybe, just maybe, Earl had been right about some things and had spent decades collecting evidence that would eventually save my ass. The note from Earl that I found in the briefcase was written on yellow legal paper in his shaky handwriting that looked like a seismograph during an earthquake. It was direct and paranoid in equal measure. Marcus, this is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. Don't trust anyone from Langdon's Circle. Claire is not who you think she is. Finish what your father started. Graham Lockwood has been planning this for years. Your kids deserve better than lies. He'd underlined, Claire is not who you think she is 3 times, which in Earl's communication style meant this was important enough to pay attention to even if everything else seemed crazy. There was also a warning about my cousin Darren, who Earl described as someone who dances with the wolves for a paycheck, which was Earl's poetic way of saying Darren was working for the wrong people and couldn't be trusted. Darren was the kind of family member who showed up to reunions driving a car he couldn't afford, wearing watches that seemed expensive, and making vague references to consulting work that nobody believed was legitimate. I'd always assumed Darren was just a hustler who'd found creative ways to make money without actually working a real job. But according to Earl's note, Darren was actively involved in whatever conspiracy had destroyed my life. The note suggested I avoid him completely, which wasn't hard since Darren and I hadn't spoken in about 4 years anyway after he'd borrowed $2,000 and never paid it back. Earl had been secretly saving money for decades, squirreling it away in small accounts at different banks, buying bonds under different names, hiding cash in places that would make a drug dealer nervous. $50 here in a savings account at First National, a $100 bond there at Community Credit Union. Everything spread out and diversified in a way that was either genius or the product of severe paranoia, possibly both. Everything was legal enough to make a banker yawn if they bothered looking, which nobody ever did because Earl kept the amounts small enough not to trigger any reporting requirements or red flags. He'd been building this financial safety net for years, piece by piece, like a squirrel with a mortgage and a detailed spreadsheet. The $60,000 in the briefcase was more than just travel money. It was a compass pointing me toward something bigger. The plane ticket said fly to Boise, Idaho, with a departure date that was 2 days away, and the address was for a small town outside the city called Garden Valley, which sounded like the kind of place that had a single blinking stoplight, a diner where everybody knew each other's business, and secrets buried deeper than the frost line. That was exactly the kind of place where someone like Earl would hide something important, somewhere remote enough that nobody would think to look, but accessible enough that someone with a plane ticket and 60 grand could actually get there. I sat on my squeaky cot in my storage unit, surrounded by boxes of my former life, holding a briefcase full of cash from a dead conspiracy theorist who apparently had been right about everything, and I tried to process what this all meant. My uncle, who I'd written off as a harmless lunatic, had somehow known that my marriage was a lie, that Graham was planning something, that my father, who died 10 years ago in what everyone said was a simple accident at the mill, had started something that needed finishing. Earl had left me breadcrumbs in the form of cash and cryptic warnings, and now I had to decide whether to follow them or just take the money and disappear into a new life somewhere far away from storage units and supervised visits with my kids. I told myself I was going to Boise for answers, and maybe also for a steak that didn't come from a can and wasn't eaten with a spoon. I packed my duffel bag with the few possessions I still owned: 3 shirts that didn't have visible stains, 2 pairs of jeans that still fit despite my storage unit diet, my dad's old wristwatch that had stopped working but I kept anyway, the cash from Earl's briefcase bundled in a gallon-sized freezer bag, and what was left of my pride, which could probably fit in one of those tiny Ziploc bags you use for travel-sized toiletries. I tried to be brave and funny at the same time, because humor is cheaper than therapy and approximately twice as portable. I made jokes to myself about how I was going on a treasure hunt organized by a dead man who believed the government was putting tracking devices in birthday cakes, and how this was either going to be the best decision I'd ever made or the beginning of a true crime podcast about a guy who disappeared in Idaho chasing conspiracy theories. Carl knocked on my unit to do his nightly check and found me packing. He looked at the duffel bag, looked at me, and said, "You running towards something or away from something?" I told him I wasn't entirely sure, but I'd let him know when I figured it out. He handed me a protein bar from his lunch and said, "Either way, don't skip meals. I've seen what happens to guys who chase ghosts on an empty stomach. It never ends well." I left the storage unit keys with Brenda at the front desk, paid for 3 months in advance using some of Earl's cash because I wasn't sure when or if I'd be back, and told her to donate anything I left behind to Goodwill if I didn't return. She looked at me with that expression people get when they think you're about to do something really stupid, but they're too polite to say it out loud. "Good luck," she said, which could mean anything from, "I hope you find what you're looking for," to, "I'll probably see you on the news." I took a red-eye flight to Boise because that's what men who almost have plans but not quite do when they're running on desperation and $60,000 in unmarked bills. The ticket Earl had left me was for a discount airline that charged extra for everything including breathing, or at least it felt that way when they tried to make me pay $15 to bring a duffel bag that weighed less than a toddler. The flight left at 11:30 at night from a regional airport that smelled like industrial cleaner and sadness, and I spent the entire 3 hours wedged between a businessman who snored like a chainsaw and a college kid who watched TikTok videos without headphones like some kind of sociopath. I didn't sleep, partly because the seats were designed by someone who hated the human spine, and partly because my brain wouldn't shut up long enough to let me rest. It just kept cycling through the same questions on repeat. What was Earl trying to tell me? What did my father start that needed finishing? How deep did Graham's betrayal actually go? And the big one that kept me awake more than the snoring businessman. Was I about to waste 60 grand chasing a dead man's paranoid fantasies? Or was I actually onto something real? Boise hit me like a cold slap when I stepped off the plane at 4 in the morning. It was late October and the temperature had dropped into the 30s, which my storage unit-adjusted body was absolutely not prepared for. The air smelled like pine trees and fresh disappointment, with a hint of airport jet fuel thrown in for complexity. I rented a car using Earl's cash and a credit card I'd been avoiding using because it was probably maxed out, got myself the cheapest sedan they had available, and drove toward Garden Valley while the sun came up over mountains that looked like someone had photoshopped them for being too pretty to be real. The address Earl had given me was about 90 minutes outside Boise, in a town so small it made my hometown look like Manhattan. Garden Valley had one main street, 2 churches, a gas station that also sold live bait, and the kind of quiet that makes city people nervous because they're not used to hearing their own thoughts. I pulled up to the property around 6 in the morning, exhausted and wired at the same time, running on gas station coffee that tasted like it had been brewed using water from a tire fire. The mailbox at the end of the gravel driveway said, "Finch," in faded letters that had been there long enough to survive multiple winters and presidential administrations. So Earl had been practical even about his mailbox, which tracked with a man who'd spent decades preparing for scenarios that may or may not have been real. The property itself was about 3 acres of scrub brush and pine trees, with a single-level ranch house that looked like it had been built sometime in the 70s and hadn't been updated since. There was a detached shed out back that had newer locks on it than anything else on the property, which immediately made it the most interesting structure on the lot. Before I could even get out of the rental car, a woman emerged from the hardware store next door, which I hadn't noticed because it was basically just a larger shed with a hand-painted sign that said Valley Hardware and more. She was maybe 60, built like someone who'd spent her entire life lifting heavy things without complaining, and she had a coffee mug in one hand and a look on her face that said she'd been watching me since I pulled up. "You must be Marcus," she said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "Earl said you'd show up eventually, though he thought it'd be sooner. I'm Marla. I run the hardware store, and before you ask, yes, I know everything about everyone in this town, because that's what happens when you've lived somewhere for 40 years and people need screws and gossip in equal measure." I liked her immediately, which was dangerous because I'd recently learned that my judgment about people was absolutely terrible. She invited me inside for tea, which I accepted because I was freezing and also because turning down hospitality from someone who might have information seemed stupid. Her shop was exactly what you'd expect: tools hanging on pegboards, paint cans stacked in pyramids, and a space heater that was working overtime to keep the place above hypothermia temperatures. Marla made tea that was stronger than most coffee and told me about Earl with the kind of fond exasperation usually reserved for describing difficult relatives or pets with personality disorders. "Your uncle used to come get parts at 3 in the morning, she said, shaking her head. "He'd bang on my door, wake up me and my husband Roy, God rest his soul, and swear at his coffee while explaining why he needed a specific type of hinge right that second. Man was brilliant and infuriating in equal measure. Called me Marcus's surprise in his notes, like you were an accidental ingredient in a pie he'd been baking for 30 years. She handed me a key to the shed, which Earl had apparently left with her along with instructions to give it to me when I showed up. He said you'd know what to do with what's in there, Marla told me, refilling my tea without asking if I wanted more. Also said not to trust anyone who drives a black Cadillac, which seemed oddly specific, but that was Earl for you. He didn't trust half the world and was probably right about most of it. The shed behind Earl's house looked normal from the outside: weathered wood, a decent roof, windows that had been blacked out with paint, but inside it was organized like a library designed by someone with severe OCD and a healthy paranoia about government surveillance. There were filing cabinets labeled by year, boxes stacked and indexed with a system that would make librarians weep with joy, and in the back corner, hidden under a tarp and some strategically placed old paint cans, there was a trapdoor that led down to a crawl space that had been dug into the earth. I climbed down using a ladder that Earl had secured with the kind of hardware that suggested he expected this crawl space to outlast the apocalypse. The space was maybe 6 feet tall and about 10 feet square, lit by battery-powered LED strips that still worked, and it was full of boxes, papers, and a tape recorder that looked like it belonged in a museum about the 1980s. The first thing I found was a photograph in a frame, protected by bubble wrap like it was a precious artifact. My father, Daniel Hale, standing next to a young Graham Lockwood in what looked like the Langdon Mill workshop, both of them smiling and shaking hands like they were sealing some kind of deal. My dad looked happy, which made seeing Graham's face in the photo feel like discovering a snake in a basket of puppies. That photograph was the beginning of a map I didn't yet know how to read, but I could feel the shape of it forming in my mind. Graham and my father had known each other longer than I'd realized. They'd had some kind of relationship before I was even born, which meant whatever had destroyed my life hadn't started 6 months ago when I walked in on Graham and Claire. It had started decades earlier, and I'd just been too stupid or too trusting or too busy working to notice the pieces connecting. Along the way to this frozen shed in Idaho, I'd started making allies without really meaning to. The way you collect spare change in your pockets without noticing until you need quarters for the laundromat. There was Agent Rosa Vega, who worked in a small federal field office in Boise and apparently loved donuts enough that her co-workers had nicknamed her glazed rosa, which she wore as a badge of honor. I'd met her by accident at a gas station where she was buying what appeared to be a dozen maple bars, and I was buying more terrible coffee. And we'd struck up a conversation about Idaho winters that turned into her giving me her card and saying, "You look like someone who's about to step in something deep. Call me if you need someone with a badge and low expectations." There was Pete, who used to work at Langdon Mill before Graham fired him for asking too many questions about safety violations, and who now ran a towing service and spent his free time nursing grudges against his former employer with the dedication of someone tending a garden. And there was June, who ran the only diner in Garden Valley and made hash browns that could make you believe in God and observations that could make you question everything else. She looked at me over the counter while I ate breakfast and said, "Men with cash in storage units tend to do one of two things: run or fight. Choose well, honey, because both options have consequences and only one of them lets you sleep at night." I chose to fight, mostly because I'd never been good at running and my knees were made of sarcasm and stubbornness in equal measure. Inside the crawl space beneath Earl's shed, my uncle had organized decades of evidence like a librarian who specialized in documenting other people's crimes and had a serious chip on his shoulder about alphabetical order. There were filing cabinets that had been lowered down here piece by piece, probably in the middle of the night by a paranoid old man with a pulley system and determination. There were boxes labeled by year going back to 1987, each one containing documents that had been sorted, cross-referenced, and indexed with the kind of attention to detail that would make the Library of Congress jealous. There were photographs in protective sleeves, receipts in chronological order, and enough evidence to keep a team of federal prosecutors busy for the next 5 years, assuming any of them gave a damn about corruption in small-town lumber mills. The audio tapes were the cruelest part of Earl's collection, because they had conversations that stopped being private years ago and were now stored on cassettes that looked like they'd survived multiple presidential administrations. Earl had labeled each tape with dates, locations, and participants, using a label maker that probably cost him $40 at Office Depot and had gotten more use than any label maker in human history. I found a portable cassette player that still worked, because of course Earl had maintained his equipment like it was mission-critical intelligence hardware, and I started listening to tapes while sitting on the dirt floor of a crawl space in Idaho, which is not how I'd imagined spending my Thursday morning, but here we were. The first tape I played made my stomach drop like I'd just driven over a cliff and hadn't hit the bottom yet. It was Claire's voice, younger than I remembered, but unmistakably hers, talking to someone whose voice I recognized, even though I wished I didn't. She sounded nervous, talking fast the way she did when she was lying about something and hoping nobody would notice. "We can't rush it," she said on the tape, her voice slightly distorted by age and cheap recording equipment. "He suspects nothing. We need more time. Marcus is trusting, almost stupidly trusting. He believes what you tell him as long as you say it with confidence." The man on the tape, Graham Lockwood, speaking in that same smooth voice he used to sell lumber contracts and apparently to orchestrate the complete destruction of other people's lives, responded with the kind of calm that made my blood pressure spike into dangerous territory. "We'll wait," he said, like they were discussing dinner reservations instead of a conspiracy. "The pieces are in place. We just need patience. When the time comes, we'll move, and Marcus won't see it coming until it's too late. He's a good worker, dependable, exactly the kind of man who doesn't ask the right questions because he's too busy doing the right things." I sat there listening to my wife and my boss discuss me like I was a chess piece they were planning to sacrifice, and I had to pause the tape because my hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the cassette player. This conversation had happened years ago, which meant Claire hadn't just gotten involved with Graham recently. This had been planned, orchestrated, a long con that had taken years to execute. I'd been married to someone who was working against me the entire time, someone who'd pretended to love me while setting up the dominoes that would eventually knock my entire life into rubble. There were more tapes, dozens of them, each one worse than the last. There were bank records showing payments to Claire's maiden name, Claire Brennan, going back almost 10 years, small deposits of a few $100s at first, then larger amounts as time went on. The deposits were timed strategically around school breaks and church events, moments when Claire could claim she'd made extra money doing freelance work or selling crafts at farmers markets. Explanations I'd never questioned, because why would I question my wife about having more money? The records showed a pattern of payments that started before we'd even gotten married, which meant Graham had been grooming her, paying her, setting her up as a plan in my life before I'd even proposed. There were also maintenance orders for Langdon Mill that had been falsified, safety inspections that had been signed off on without actually being performed, reports about equipment failures that had been buried instead of addressed. My father's signature appeared on some of the older documents, but they'd been altered, changed in ways that were subtle but clear once you knew what to look for. Someone had been sabotaging the mill's maintenance records for decades, creating a paper trail that made it look like my father, who'd been the safety supervisor before his accident, had been negligent when in reality he'd been trying to fix problems that kept getting covered up. Earl had also recorded conversations where local officials discussed keeping what they called the machine running, which was apparently code for maintaining a system of corruption that benefited everyone in power while screwing over everyone else. One of the recorded conversations featured Mayor Hargrove, the same mayor Earl used to call a sugar-tongued weasel at public events, laughing with a county commissioner about environmental reports that had been conveniently lost. "Nobody reads the fine print anyway," Hargrove said on the tape, his voice full of the kind of casual corruption that makes you want to throw tape players at walls. "We approve the permits. They pay the fees. Everyone wins except the people who don't matter." The file showed environmental reports that had been ignored, safety checks that had been skipped, violations that had been swept under carpets so thick you could hide bodies under them. There were photographs of equipment that should have been replaced years ago, machinery that was held together with duct tape and prayers, and the hope that nobody would get killed before the next quarterly review. There were incident reports that had never been filed, worker complaints that had disappeared into filing cabinets, a whole system of negligence and corruption that had been operating for so long it had become normal. Judge Rourke's name appeared in several documents, showing payments from a shell company that traced back to Langdon Mill's parent corporation. The payments were listed as consulting fees, which is what corrupt people call bribes when they want them to look legitimate on tax forms. Earl had tracked the money through multiple accounts, creating flowcharts that looked like conspiracy theory maps, but were actually just accurate representations of how dirty money moves through small-town America when nobody's paying attention. I sat on the dirt floor surrounded by evidence of crimes that went back decades, feeling my anger crystallize into something harder and more focused. The humor at that moment was dark, the kind of humor you need when you're staring at proof that your entire life has been a lie orchestrated by people who saw you as nothing more than a useful idiot. I told myself I should have been more suspicious of a marriage that required so much dry cleaning, should have questioned why Claire always had new clothes, but we could never afford to fix the air conditioning, should have noticed that Graham paid more attention to my wife at company barbecues than he did to actual company business. Earl had left a note taped to the inside of one of the filing cabinets, written on a sticky note in his shaky handwriting. "Marcus, if you're reading this, it means I was right and also dead, which is a real mixed bag emotionally. These people destroyed your father, and they'll destroy you too if you let them. The choice is yours. Run with the money and live with ghosts, or fight with the truth and sleep at night. Either way, don't trust anyone who smiles too much in photographs. Love, Uncle Earl. P.S. There's more money in account number 4478 at Mountain West Credit Union. Password is your father's badge number. Use it wisely or use it foolishly. Just use it." I laughed, then cried, then laughed again because Earl had managed to be helpful and cryptic and weirdly sweet even in death. He'd spent decades building this case, collecting evidence while everyone thought he was just a paranoid old man who handed out pamphlets about fluoride. He'd been right about everything, and he'd organized it all so that someone, me, apparently, could finish what my father had started before his convenient accident at the mill that maybe wasn't actually an accident. I took photographs of everything with my phone, uploaded them to a cloud storage account I created using a fake email address, and then made copies of the copies because paranoia seemed pretty reasonable at this point. I packed the most important documents into my duffel bag, left the rest organized exactly as Earl had left them, and climbed back up the ladder into the shed feeling like I'd just downloaded the entire operating system of a criminal conspiracy directly into my brain. Marla was waiting for me outside with more tea and a look that said she knew exactly what I'd found down there. Earl was crazy, she said, handing me a thermos. But he was the good kind of crazy, the kind that actually gives a damn about truth. Whatever you found in there, use it well. This town's got long memories and short patience for bullshit. Earl didn't just leave me papers and evidence in a crawl space full of the kind of documentation that could make federal prosecutors weep with joy. He left me a choice, wrapped up in a video recording on an old camcorder that probably weighed more than most modern laptops and had the kind of battery life that suggested it was powered by pure spite. I found the camcorder in a box labeled, "Watch this first, you stubborn idiot," which was very on-brand for Earl and also made me laugh despite the fact that I was sitting in a shed in Idaho surrounded by evidence of a decades-long conspiracy that had destroyed my family. I set up the camcorder on a workbench, plugged it into an outlet because the battery was deader than disco, and pressed play on a video that Earl had apparently recorded about 6 months before he died. The image quality was terrible, all grainy and washed out like someone had filmed it through a dirty window, but Earl's face filled the screen looking exactly like I remembered. Wild gray hair that stuck up in every direction, glasses held together with electrical tape, and a cardigan that had seen better decades. He was sitting in what looked like this same shed, surrounded by his files, and he had that expression on his face that said he was about to deliver wisdom whether you wanted it or not. "Marcus," he started, coughing into his fist before continuing. "If you're watching this, it means I'm dead and you found my treasure map, which is really just evidence of crimes, but treasure map sounds more adventurous. Life is about to give you 2 options, and neither of them is great. But that's how life works when you're dealing with people who think morality is optional. Option 1. Take the cash I left you, maybe the additional money in the accounts I set up, and run. Change your name to something generic like Bob Johnson. Move to Florida or Arizona or wherever people go to disappear into golf courses and early bird specials. Buy yourself a boat or a food truck or whatever the hell makes you happy, and forget that any of this ever happened." He paused to adjust his glasses, which slid down his nose the way they always did, and I felt a weird pang of grief mixed with gratitude that this crazy old man had cared enough about me to spend his final years building a case against people who deserved it. "If you take that option," Earl continued, pointing at the camera like he was personally judging me through time and space, "you'll have enough money to live comfortably for a while. You can start over, build a new life, maybe find someone who won't betray you for a man in a nice suit and a Cadillac. But here's the thing, Marcus, and I want you to really hear this. You'll spend the rest of your life knowing you ran. You'll lie awake at night thinking about Ben and Sophie growing up believing lies about their father. You'll see yourself in mirrors and know you had the power to fight back and chose comfort instead. And let me tell you from personal experience, that kind of regret is heavier than any amount of money can fix." Earl coughed again, longer this time, and I could see in the video that he was sick, that whatever was going to kill him was already working its way through his system. He took a sip of water from a mug that said, "World's okayest uncle," which I'd given him as a joke about 10 years ago, and I had to pause the video for a second because seeing him drink from that stupid mug made the whole thing feel real in a way that hurt. When I pressed play again, Earl was leaning forward, his face serious in a way I'd rarely seen. "Option 2, you fight. You use everything I've collected, every document, every recording, every piece of evidence I've spent the last 30 years gathering, and you burn these people down. You expose Graham, Claire, the judge, the mayor, all of them. You show the world what they did to your father, what they did to you, what they've been doing to this town for decades. It won't be easy. They have money, power, lawyers who specialize in making guilty people look innocent. You'll be threatened, harassed, maybe worse. You might lose more than you've already lost. But Marcus, if you fight, you might actually win. And even if you don't win completely, you'll make them uncomfortable. You'll make them pay a price for what they did. And you'll be able to look your kids in the eye someday and tell them their father didn't run when it mattered." Earl smiled then, that crooked smile that made him look like a mischievous grandfather who was about to suggest something wildly inappropriate. "Either way, you'll have a good story at funerals. People love stories about men who either ran successfully or fought stupidly. Both options make decent epitaphs." He coughed again, waved at the camera, and said, "Choose well, Marcus. Your father would be proud of you no matter what, but I think we both know which choice lets you sleep at night. Love you, kid. Don't let the bastards win. Oh, And there's one more account I didn't mention in the notes. Check with Mountain West Credit Union, account number 4478. Password is your dad's old badge number. That's the real fortune. Use it to fight or use it to run, but for God's sake, use it. Okay, I'm tired. This is Earl Finch, signing off from beyond the grave like some kind of paranoid ghost. Good luck. The video ended and I sat there staring at the blank screen, feeling like I'd just been given homework by a dead man who knew me better than I knew myself. I rewound the tape and watched it 2 more times, taking notes, memorizing details, trying to figure out what the hell Earl meant by the real fortune. The $60,000 in cash had seemed like a lot of money when I found it in the storage unit, but Earl was talking about something bigger, something that made 60 grand look like pocket change for parking meters. I called Mountain West Credit Union using a phone number I found in Earl's files, and after navigating through about 15 minutes of automated menus that made me want to throw my phone into the nearest body of water, I finally got a human being who sounded bored enough to actually be helpful. I gave them the account number and my father's badge number, 2847, which I remembered because he used to make me recite it as a kid in case of emergencies. And the woman on the phone went quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Mr. Hale," she finally said, her voice suddenly much more professional and alert. "I'm going to need to transfer you to our trust department. Please hold." The whole music was smooth jazz that sounded like it was being played by people who'd given up on their dreams. And after about 5 minutes, a man named Richard came on the line and explained that Earl had set up a trust in my name that contained something called mineral rights to property that my father had refused to sell back in the 80s. Richard used a lot of financial terms that I barely understood, but the bottom line was this. My father had owned mineral rights to land near Langdon Mill, rights that Graham and his partners had been trying to buy for decades because apparently there were valuable deposits under the property. My father had refused every offer, saying the land shouldn't be strip mined for profit. And when he died in his accident at the mill, those rights had gone to my mother, who died 5 years later without knowing what she had. Earl had somehow gotten control of the rights, protected them through legal battles I'd never heard about, and now they were worth somewhere between $8 and $12 million depending on current market conditions and which mining company wanted them most. $8 to $12 million. The words didn't even sound real. I'd been living in a storage unit eating canned beans, and the entire time there was a trust fund with my name on it worth enough money to never worry about storage units again. But Earl had hidden it, protected it, made sure I couldn't access it until I'd seen the evidence, until I'd understood what was at stake. He'd spent decades buying legal arguments, paying for environmental audits, collecting witness statements, building a case that was so thorough and documented that it was basically a bomb waiting for someone to light the fuse. Earl had wrapped up justice like a present and left it for me to either open or ignore. I could walk away right now, access that trust, liquidate those mineral rights, and disappear into a new life somewhere far away from Graham and Claire and judges who took bribes. I could become Bob Johnson from Florida, buy a boat called Second Chance, and spend my remaining years fishing and trying not to think about the family I'd left behind. Or I could dig in, use Earl's files to pull apart a machine made of corrupt people who thought they were untouchable, and risk losing everything including possibly my life. I thought about Ben, my son who wouldn't talk to me during supervised visits. I thought about Sophie, my daughter who asked technical questions about unjust legal systems because that was her way of saying she believed I'd been wronged. I thought about my father, Daniel Hale, smiling in that photograph next to Graham before Graham became the kind of man who destroys families for profit. I thought about Earl, dying alone surrounded by evidence because he believed truth mattered more than comfort. I chose not to run. I chose to make these people uncomfortable, to use every piece of evidence Earl had collected to fight back with the kind of determination that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. Also, I hate being the kind of man who leaves loose ends hanging. It's messy, unsatisfying, the kind of thing that haunts you during commercial breaks and keeps you awake at 3 in the morning wondering what might have been different if you just had the courage to finish what you started. Back in our county, Agent Rosa Vega took one look at the files I brought back from Idaho and stopped pretending she'd seen nothing like this before, which was refreshing because most federal agents act like they've witnessed every crime in human history and nothing surprises them anymore. Rosa was different. She sat in her tiny field office in Boise eating maple bars from a box she'd bought specifically for this meeting, flipping through Earl's documentation with the kind of focused intensity that made me think maybe, just maybe, I hadn't wasted my time chasing a dead conspiracy theorist's paper trail across state lines. After about 45 minutes of reading documents and occasionally saying "holy shit" under her breath, she looked up at me with powdered sugar on her lip and said, "Marcus, your uncle was either the most paranoid genius I've ever encountered, or he was completely insane and just happened to stumble onto an actual criminal conspiracy. Either way, this is enough to open a federal investigation, and I'm going to need you to not leave town or do anything stupid while we build this case." I promised not to do anything stupid, which was a lie because my entire life up to this point had been a series of increasingly stupid decisions. But Rosa seemed satisfied enough to start making phone calls to people whose titles I didn't understand, but who apparently had the power to make things happen. The FBI doesn't move fast on gossip or hunches or angry divorced guys with axes to grind. They move on paper, documentation, evidence that can survive cross-examination by lawyers who charge $1,000 an hour to find loopholes in airtight cases. Luckily, Earl had provided enough paper to build a case that could survive a nuclear blast, multiple appeals, and probably several apocalyptic events. The investigation began with the kind of bureaucratic slowness that makes watching paint dry look exciting. There were subpoenas that had to be drafted, reviewed, approved by judges who weren't corrupt, which apparently was harder to find than you'd think in our county. There were bank records that needed freezing, which required warrants, which required probable cause, which required more paperwork than I thought existed in the entire universe. There were sealed warrants for wiretaps, surveillance operations, interviews with former employees who'd been fired or quit under suspicious circumstances. The whole thing moved like a glacier made of legal documents, slow and grinding, but ultimately unstoppable. I spent the next 6 months living in a tiny apartment in Boise that Rosa helped me find, paying rent with money from Earl's accounts while the investigation churned forward at the speed of government bureaucracy. The apartment was a studio that had probably been somebody's storage closet in a previous life, with a kitchen that consisted of a hot plate and a mini fridge, a bathroom where you could sit on the toilet and wash your hands in the sink simultaneously, and a view of a parking lot that made my storage unit look downright scenic. I ate frozen meals from the discount grocery store, spent my days meeting with federal prosecutors who had questions about everything Earl had documented, and my nights watching bad television while trying not to think about how my kids were growing up without me. The waiting was the hardest part. I'd handed over everything. All of Earl's files, recordings, photographs, financial documents. And now I was just this guy sitting in a crappy apartment, hoping that the machine of justice would actually work for once instead of grinding up innocent people and spitting them out as statistics. Rosa would call me every few weeks with updates that were mostly, "We're making progress," and "Don't talk to anyone about this," which is what federal agents say when they can't tell you anything useful but want you to know they haven't forgotten about you. Then, after months of silence punctuated by occasional reassuring phone calls, things started happening fast. We had to let the machine do its work, and apparently the machine had finally gotten enough coffee and decided to wake up. It felt like watching an old grandfather clock that had been wound wrong for decades finally getting the right key and suddenly working the way it was supposed to. The press smelled blood in the water first, which is how you know something real is about to happen in small-town America. When reporters who usually cover county fairs and high school football suddenly start using words like corruption and federal investigation in their headlines. The local newspaper ran a story, "Small-town scandal, lumber chief in crosshairs." The headline was conservative compared to what was actually happening, but it was enough to make people start asking questions. Then the regional news picked it up, then the state news, and suddenly Graham Lockwood and Mayor Hargrove and Judge Rourke were being discussed on evening broadcasts by anchors who pronounced our town's name wrong, but got the corruption part exactly right. Langdon Mills' main office got raided on a Tuesday morning in early spring, which I only knew about because Rosa called me to say turn on the news and enjoy the show. I watched on my tiny television as federal agents in windbreakers that said FBI in letters big enough to read from space carried boxes out of the building where I'd worked for 18 years. Employees stood around in the parking lot looking confused and scared, probably wondering if their jobs were about to disappear along with their boss's freedom. I felt bad for them. Most of the people working at Langdon were decent folks just trying to make a living, but I also felt a savage satisfaction watching the place get torn apart by people with badges and warrants. Graham was arrested at the country club during a Thursday morning breakfast meeting with investors, which was apparently where rich people go to eat overpriced eggs and discuss their crimes in between golf games. The footage made the evening news. Graham in handcuffs being walked out past people in polo shirts and visors who looked absolutely scandalized that federal agents would dare interrupt their Belgian waffles with something as gauche as a public arrest. Graham kept his head up, didn't say anything to the cameras, maintained that executive composure even while being perp-walked past the 18th hole. I watched that clip about 15 times, rewinding it each time the handcuffs clicked shut, which probably said something about my mental health, but I didn't care. Mayor Hargrove resigned rather than answer questions, issuing a statement through his lawyer that said he was stepping down to focus on personal matters, which is what corrupt politicians say when they mean, "I'm guilty as hell, but I'm hoping if I quit now they'll go easier on me." The county commissioners accepted his resignation with what they called deep regret, which is politician speak for, "We're throwing this guy under the bus before he drags us down with him." Judge Rourke got caught in recorded phone calls accepting favors from Graham's shell companies, discussing cases before they came to her courtroom, basically doing everything a judge isn't supposed to do except maybe taking actual bags of cash with dollar signs on them. She was suspended pending an ethics investigation that everyone knew would end with her disbarment and probably jail time. The recordings were damning, her laughing about manipulating custody hearings, joking about how easy it was to make certain outcomes happen if the price was right. Hearing her voice on those tapes, so casual about destroying families for money, made me want to punch walls again, but I'd learned my lesson about expressing emotions through property damage. Claire was arrested at school pickup, which is a horrible place for anyone to get handcuffed, especially someone who'd spent years cultivating an image as the perfect PTA mom who volunteered for every bake sale and smiled in every school photograph. I wasn't there, thank God, but I heard about it from about 6 different people who called me with variations of "Did you hear what happened to Claire?" She was charged with conspiracy, fraud, and a bunch of other crimes that carried serious prison time. The prosecutors had evidence of her involvement going back years. The payments, the recorded conversations, her active participation in the scheme to destroy my father's legacy and frame him posthumously for negligence. She called me from the booking room phone, crying in that way people cry when they've finally realized consequences are real and apply to them personally. "Marcus," she sobbed, her voice breaking in a way that might have moved me 6 months ago, but now just sounded like someone who'd gotten caught and regretted it. "They're taking my life away. They're saying I could go to prison for years. You have to help me. Tell them I didn't know what I was doing. Tell them Graham manipulated me. Tell them something." I held the phone away from my ear for a second, taking a breath, trying to find words that were honest without being cruel. "Claire," I said finally, keeping my voice level, "you helped plant the weeds in this garden. You watered them. You helped them grow, and now you're surprised they've taken over everything. I'll pick the flowers with our kids. You deal with the weeds you created." She started saying something else, but I hung up because I'd run out of sympathy for people who'd spent years destroying my life and only felt bad when they got caught. It was a small mercy that she finally stopped pretending to be spotless, stopped acting like she was the victim in a situation she'd helped orchestrate for profit. They called it the Langdon Conspiracy, which made it sound way more organized and impressive than it actually was, like we'd uncovered some elaborate international crime ring instead of just a bunch of greedy people in a small town who thought they were smarter than everyone else. The charges stuck like super glue on fingers, which is to say they weren't coming off no matter how hard the expensive lawyers tried to peel them away. Graham Lockwood got 15 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and about 8 other charges that the prosecutors threw at him like they were playing legal darts, and every throw was a bullseye. His lawyers tried to argue that he was just a businessman making tough decisions in a competitive market, which is what rich people's lawyers say when they mean my client is guilty, but we're hoping the jury is stupid enough to believe this nonsense. The jury was not stupid. Graham went away in handcuffs for the second time, and this time there were no country club breakfasts waiting for him on the other side. Mayor Hargrove pleaded guilty to corruption charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, which meant he only got 8 years instead of the 20 he probably deserved. He had to forfeit his pension, pay back approximately $300,000 in bribes and kickbacks that he'd collected over the years, and live with the knowledge that his Wikipedia page would forever list him as disgraced former mayor, instead of whatever legacy he'd been hoping to leave. Several other county officials got indicted as part of the investigation, creating a domino effect of arrests that made our local government look like a criminal organization that occasionally held elections for appearances. Judge Rourke got disbarred, which meant she couldn't practice law anymore, and also got sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for accepting bribes and manipulating court proceedings. Every case she presided over for the last decade got reviewed, and dozens of decisions got overturned, which created absolute chaos in the county court system, but also meant that people who'd been screwed by her corruption finally got some measure of justice. My custody case was one of the first ones reviewed, and a new judge took about 15 minutes to look at the evidence and decide that the original ruling had been based on fabricated concerns and biased testimony. The new judge was a woman named Sandra Ochoa, who didn't smile too much and had a reputation for actually reading case files instead of just signing whatever lawyers put in front of her. Claire did 3 years in a minimum security facility that was basically summer camp with bars, which seemed light considering her role in the whole thing. But apparently cooperating with prosecutors and showing remorse gets you discounts on prison time. The scandal changed her into someone different, someone who kept her head down and stopped pretending she was the victim of circumstances beyond her control. When she got out, she moved to another state and started working some office job under her maiden name, sending child support payments on time and calling the kids once a month to have awkward conversations that nobody enjoyed but everyone tolerated because that's what fractured families do. The court gave me full custody of Ben and Sophie in a hearing that took about 20 minutes and involved Judge Ochoa basically apologizing on behalf of the entire judicial system for the clusterfuck that had been my previous custody arrangement. "Mr. Hale," she said, looking at me over her reading glasses, "I'm genuinely sorry for what happened to you. The system failed you spectacularly, and while I can't undo the damage, I can make sure it doesn't continue." She signed the papers, gave me custody, eliminated the supervised visits, and told the social worker assigned to my case that her services were no longer needed unless I specifically requested them. The first night I got Ben and Sophie back was awkward in the way that all major life transitions are awkward, like we were 3 people who used to know each other really well, but had forgotten how to be a family. I'd rented a proper house using money from Earl's Trust, nothing fancy, but big enough that everyone had their own bedroom, and we had a kitchen with an actual oven instead of a hot plate. Ben stood in the living room with his duffel bag, looking around like he was evaluating whether this place met his standards, his arms crossed in that defensive posture he'd perfected over the last year. He was almost 16 now, taller than me, and carrying anger like a backpack full of rocks that he refused to set down. Sophie walked through the house doing a full inspection, checking closets and outlets and asking practical questions about the internet speed and whether we were going to get a dog because, statistically, families with dogs report higher satisfaction levels. Dad Marcus. She'd grown her hair longer, lost the baby fat in her face, and developed the kind of sharp intelligence that was either going to make her a CEO or a supervillain, possibly both. I made pancakes for dinner that first night because I couldn't think of anything else to make, and pancakes felt symbolic somehow, like we were starting over from breakfast even though it was 7 in the evening. I burned the first batch because I was nervous and forgot to adjust the heat, and the smoke detector went off, and I stood there waving a dish towel at the ceiling while cursing and apologizing simultaneously. Sophie laughed. Actually laughed, the first real laugh I'd heard from her in over a year, and said, "Dad, you're still terrible at this." Ben almost smiled, caught himself, but I saw it. That brief moment where his anger cracked just enough to let something else through. We ate slightly less burned pancakes at the kitchen table, the 3 of us sitting in chairs that didn't quite match because I'd bought furniture from various thrift stores and hadn't worried about aesthetics. It was quiet at first, the kind of uncomfortable silence where everyone's chewing sounds impossibly loud. Then Sophie started talking about a rocket competition she wanted to enter, and Ben mentioned that football tryouts were coming up in the spring, and suddenly we were having an actual conversation instead of just existing in the same room pretending everything was fine. The nights got easier slowly, the way broken bones heal slowly, with setbacks and painful moments, but gradual progress that you only notice when you look back at where you started. Ben's anger was like a fist that needed time to unclench, and it took months of late-night talks and patient listening before he could even articulate why he was so angry. He blamed me for the divorce at first, which hurt but made sense because kids need someone to blame, and I was the safe target. Then he blamed Claire, then Graham, then himself for not seeing what was happening. We worked through it together, sometimes with the help of a therapist who specialized in families recovering from trauma, sometimes just the two of us throwing a football in the backyard while not really talking about feelings, but somehow addressing them anyway. Sophie wanted to know everything about the case, the investigation, the legal proceedings, all of it. She read news articles, asked questions that made me realize she understood more about corruption than most adults, and wrote a school paper about miscarriages of justice that her teacher called disturbingly well-researched for a 12-year-old. She processed her trauma through intellectual curiosity, which was very her, and I supported it even when it meant explaining legal concepts I barely understood myself. I used the trust fund that Earl had left, handled by a lawyer named Patricia Mills who smelled faintly of old books and had the kind of moral outrage that made her volunteer for cases she believed in, to start Hale Timber Company, a community mill that paid fair wages and actually followed safety regulations instead of treating them as suggestions. I hired old friends who'd been burned by Langdon. Pete ran logistics and spent his lunch breaks telling stories about the good old days before Graham turned everything toxic. Carl came in for night shifts, finally getting paid properly for work he was actually doing instead of pretending not to notice people living in storage units. Even my cousin Darren, who'd been shady and working for the wrong people, gave testimony during the trial after I called him and had a conversation that smelled like regret and possibility. He worked in our accounting department now, trying to make up for past mistakes by being aggressively honest about finances. I still visit the storage unit sometimes, even though I don't need it anymore and definitely don't need the reminder of rock bottom. I sit on that same squeaky cot and remember the beans and the cold and the moment I found Earl's briefcase and decided to follow a dead man's map towards something that might have been justice or might have been revenge, but turned out to be both. I pay for the unit monthly, keeping it exactly as I left it, partly because memory needs a physical space sometimes and partly because I never want to forget what it felt like to have nothing, so I can appreciate having something. Humor returned in little things that made life feel worth living again. Ben started cracking dad jokes that were somehow worse than mine, which I took as a sign that he was healing, because only people who feel safe make terrible puns. Sophie insisted our dog, a rescue mutt named Tesla because of course she'd name a dog after an inventor, wear a tiny construction helmet when he visited the mill, and I let her, because why the hell not? I made ridiculous speeches at school assemblies about teamwork and the right kind of shovels, which made absolutely no sense, but got laughs from kids who appreciated absurdist humor. We're not rich in the way Graham and his cronies measured wealth, with multiple cars and vacation homes and the ability to buy your way out of consequences. We're rich in other things that matter more. Laughter at dinner tables, quiet Sunday mornings, the smell of pancakes that aren't burned most of the time, and the small steady work of building an honest life brick by brick. Ben got into college on a football scholarship and calls me every week to complain about his roommate. Sophie's building rockets that actually fly and talking about engineering programs at schools I can't pronounce. Earl's last joke was that the truth would be worth more than his secret savings, and he was right in ways I'm still discovering. Truth doesn't always win, but when it does, it wins completely. He also told me to never trust a man who wears too much aftershave, and I still follow that advice religiously. I avoid people who smell like they're trying to buy sympathy with cologne, people who smile too much in photographs, and anyone who thinks corruption is just business as usual. I built a good life from the ruins of a bad one, which feels like the kind of ending Earl would have appreciated. Messy, imperfect, but fundamentally honest.